The night my son-in-law grabbed my daughter's face at his mother's birthday dinner and told her to smile like she meant it, I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not reach across the table and do what every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do. I simply picked up my fork, cut a small piece of roasted chicken, and made a decision that would take everything from him before he ever saw it coming. My name is Patricia Owens. I am 63 years old, and I live 20 minutes outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a house with a porch wide enough to hold every conversation that matters. For 31 years, I sat on the family court bench in Fulton County. I have looked into the eyes of men who swore they loved the women they destroyed. I know what that love looks like. I know exactly how much it costs. I never imagined I would need that knowledge for my own child. My daughter Claire was 31 that spring. She taught second grade at an elementary school in Decatur, and she had the kind of patience with children that comes from genuinely believing every single one of them is worth fighting for. She was not a woman who doubted herself. She had opinions about everything: city policy, school funding, the proper way to make cornbread, and she defended every one of them with a calm, steady certainty that her father always said came straight from me. She married my son-in-law 2 years before that dinner. He was a cardiologist, well-dressed, well-spoken, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order after meeting you once and made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. His mother, Gloria, had been a professor of behavioral psychology at Emory for decades. She spoke about the human mind the way some people speak about scripture, with total authority and very little room for disagreement. The dinner was meant to celebrate Gloria's 70th birthday. My son-in-law had organized everything: a private room at a restaurant in Buckhead, 12 guests, white tablecloths, a carefully selected wine list. Claire had spent the afternoon making Gloria's favorite dessert from scratch, a coconut layer cake that took 3 hours because my son-in-law had told her it would mean more than anything the caterer could bring. When I arrived, Claire was already at the table. She stood to hug me, and I felt it immediately, the way a mother always feels things before she can name them. Her body was present, but her attention was elsewhere. She kept one eye on my son-in-law the way you watch a pot you are afraid to leave unattended. She wore a blouse with a high collar despite the warm Georgia evening. Her hair was pulled back tightly, not the way she usually wore it. Loose and natural and full of personality, she looked like a woman who had dressed to disappear. My son-in-law greeted me warmly. He always did. He had a handshake that communicated trustworthiness, and eyes that watched you just a half-second longer than necessary. I had seen that combination in courtrooms more times than I could count. Gloria held court at the head of the table. She was a striking woman, silver-haired, immaculate posture, the kind of person who made you feel slightly underprepared simply by existing near her. She kissed my cheek and told me I looked wonderful, and the compliment landed like an assessment. Dinner began pleasantly. My son-in-law was charming and attentive. Gloria entertained the table with a story about a research trip to Vienna. The food was beautiful. Everything was exactly right. Then Claire reached for the wine to refill the glass of the guest beside her, and she misjudged the distance. A small splash landed on the white tablecloth. Not on anyone. Not on anything important. A drop, maybe two. The table kept moving. But my son-in-law stopped. He turned to Claire slowly. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice in public. He simply looked at her and said, quietly enough that only those closest to him could hear, "You need to pay attention to what you're doing." Claire's face went carefully blank. The blankness of someone who has learned that any expression can be used against her. "I'm sorry," she said. Automatic. Practiced. Gloria reached over and patted her son's hand. "She's trying," she said lightly, with a small smile that somehow made it worse. Then my son-in-law reached over, placed his hand on Claire's jaw, angled her face slightly toward him and said, "Smile. You're making the table uncomfortable." The conversation around us continued. Most people had not noticed, but I had seen everything. And when Claire's eyes met mine for just a moment before she looked away, I understood what she was asking me, without saying a single word. I smiled at my son-in-law. I lifted my glass. I said, "What a lovely evening you've put together." And I began making notes in my mind, the way I had done for 31 years, because I knew that moment was not the time to move. That was the moment to prepare. Before my son-in-law came into her life, Claire was a woman who took up space without apology. She got that from her father, Raymond, who passed from cancer 6 years ago and left a quietness in our house that I have never quite adjusted to. Raymond believed that the people you loved most deserved your full, undivided honesty. He told Claire when she was 9 years old that her voice was not an interruption, it was a contribution. She carried that with her everywhere. As a teenager, she organized a walkout at her high school over a dress code policy she believed targeted black girls specifically. She was 14. She stood in front of the principal's office with a written list of demands and did not leave until someone listened. At 22, she turned down a position at a higher-paying private school because she said the children in the public system needed her more. She was not reckless. She was principled. There is a difference, and she always knew it. When Raymond died, something in her shifted. It softens the edges of who you are, makes you more willing to accept less than you deserve because everything already hurts and you are simply trying to find a place to rest. That was when she met my son-in-law. At a hospital fundraiser she attended with a colleague. She called me that same night. "Mom," she said, "I met someone tonight who actually listened. He asked about my students. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered what I said at the beginning of the conversation and connected it to something I said at the end." I told her I was glad. And I was. I did not know then that listening can be a form of hunting. In those early months, he made her feel extraordinary. He showed up to her classroom with lunch on days she mentioned being overwhelmed. He read books about education reform because she cared about it. He called her work important in front of his colleagues when he didn't have to. He made her feel, at the exact moment she was most vulnerable, that she had been seen correctly for the first time. Then the suggestions began. So softly, she almost didn't hear them as suggestions. "You work yourself too hard," he said. "Some of those parents don't appreciate you the way they should," he said. Not as an insult. As protection. "I just think you'd be happier with less on your plate," he said. Not as control. Each sentence arrived gently. Each one landed and stayed. Over months, they accumulated the way water shapes stone, not through force but through persistence, until the stone has a new shape and cannot remember having any other. By the time I noticed something was changing in my daughter, she had already stopped mentioning her classroom initiatives in conversation. She used to talk about her students the way Raymond talked about the people he loved, with detail and investment and pride. She started giving shorter answers, safer answers. She started looking at her phone before responding to simple questions, as if she needed to check whether her opinion was acceptable. I told myself it was grief, still working its way through her. I told myself it was the adjustment of marriage. I told myself she was a grown woman, and I needed to trust her choices. I was sitting in a courtroom the first time I truly recognized what I was watching in my own daughter. A woman on the stand, 34 years old. A teacher, actually, describing how she had stopped telling her coworkers about her weekends because her husband felt she shared too much with people who didn't need to know their business. Describing how she had started wearing her hair differently because he preferred it. Describing how she had turned down a department head position because he thought the added stress would affect their marriage. She used his reasoning, his language. She had rehearsed it so many times it had become her own. I drove to Claire's house that evening. She opened the door with a smile that arrived a half-second too late. I asked her how things were going. She said wonderful. I asked about the mentorship program she had been building at her school. She said she had stepped back from it for now because my son-in-law thought it was spreading her too thin. She said it quickly, without looking at me, and moved immediately to asking if I wanted tea. I said yes, and I watched my daughter in her own kitchen, moving with a carefulness that broke my heart in half, checking the time, arranging things that did not need arranging, existing in her own home, as if she were a guest who had not yet been told whether she was welcome. What I would later understand was the full architecture of it. My son-in-law had not raised his voice. He had not made threats. He had done something far more precise. He had identified every source of strength my daughter had: her work, her friendships, her sense of purpose, her willingness to take up space, and one by one, with patience and perfect plausible deniability, he had convinced her that each of those things was a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be celebrated. And Gloria had been the blueprint. The first time my son-in-law crossed into something I could no longer classify as emotional, Claire was at their home in Sandy Springs preparing for a dinner party. She had spent the entire day cooking. While setting the table, she placed the name cards in an order she thought made sense for conversation flow, the way she had once reorganized her classroom seating to improve how her students collaborated. My son-in-law came in, looked at the arrangement, and without a word, moved every single card back to his original plan. When Claire gently said she thought her version might work better, he set down the card in his hand, walked to her side of the table, put his hand on the back of her neck, and pressed down slowly until she lowered her head. "This is not your classroom," he said quietly. "You don't run the arrangement here." She told me this 6 months after it happened. She told me because a second incident had occurred and she was starting to run out of explanations that felt believable even to herself. The second time, he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks when she tried to leave the room during an argument. She had made the mistake of saying, in a voice that was too steady, that she disagreed with a financial decision he had made without consulting her. When she turned to walk away before the conversation escalated, he caught her wrist and told her that walking away was disrespectful, and he would not tolerate disrespect in his own house. When she showed Gloria the bruise, she told me that his mother studied it for a long moment, then nodded slowly and said, "You pushed him. You know how he gets when he feels dismissed. A strong marriage requires both people to learn their limits." Then Gloria had opened her desk drawer, taken out a small tube of arnica cream, and handed it to Claire the way you hand someone a tissue for a minor inconvenience. "This will help with the color," she said. "It should be gone in a few days." She did not offer comfort. She offered concealment. And she offered it with the calm efficiency of someone who had made this calculation many times before. When Claire told me all of this on a Tuesday afternoon in my kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had not touched, I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I held her hands across the table and I said, "I need you to trust me, and I need you to let me move carefully. Can you do that?" She nodded. She looked younger than she had in years. The exhaustion stripped away enough to show me the girl who had once stood outside a principal's office with a list of demands and refused to leave. I told her I had been waiting for the right moment. That moment had come. I began the same way I had begun every significant case in my career. Documentation. A timeline built from memory first, then from texts and photographs Claire shared with me, then from quiet conversations with 2 people from their social circle, who I had reason to believe were themselves uneasy about what they had witnessed. My son-in-law and Gloria moved fast when they sensed something had shifted. People like them always do. Within 2 weeks of that conversation with Claire, she was called into a meeting with her school principal. The meeting was framed as a routine check-in, but the principal looked uncomfortable in the way people do when they have received information they did not ask for and are not entirely sure what to do with it. Someone had raised a concern, she explained carefully, about Claire's recent focus and emotional stability. Nothing specific. Nothing actionable. Just a concern, shared through a mutual acquaintance on the school board, that Claire might be dealing with some personal difficulties that could benefit from a leave of absence. Claire came to my house afterward and sat in the same chair at my kitchen table and looked at me with eyes that were already preparing to give up. "Maybe I should just go back," she said. Maybe I made everything worse. I knew that sentence. I had heard it in every form across 31 years. Maybe I provoked him. Maybe I asked for too much. Maybe peace costs less than truth. It is the sentence people say when they have been ground down to the point where the simplest possible exit begins to look like wisdom. "Listen to me," I said. "They are doing this because it is working on you. That means it is not working on me. We are not done." 3 days later, I received an email with no subject line and no signature. The sender address was a string of random characters that would expire by morning. Inside was a single line of text. "There are things about that family you do not know yet. I am ready to tell someone who will actually use them," I replied within 4 minutes. Her name was Denise. She had worked as Gloria's graduate research assistant 12 years earlier, the last of several assistants who had all left the university within a year of starting. She had spent those 12 years deciding whether what she knew was worth the cost of sharing it, and watching Claire's situation from a distance through mutual connections had finally made that calculation simple. The files she sent arrived in 3 folders. The first contained emails. Years of them. Gloria corresponding with colleagues, with former students, with people whose relationship to the family I did not immediately understand. What made them significant was not any single message, but the pattern across all of them, a consistent, clinical methodology for what Gloria called behavioral correction in relationships. She wrote about her son the way a researcher writes about a subject. She tracked his relationships. She categorized the women he dated by what she called their resistance profile. She noted which approaches had worked to reduce resistance and which had required escalation. She used the word escalation without effect, the way you might discuss adjusting a dosage. The second folder contained records from a university ethics board inquiry filed 9 years ago by a former student who had accused Gloria of psychologically manipulating her during an independent study course. The inquiry had been dismissed. The student had withdrawn her complaint after what the records described as a meeting with university council and a resolution agreeable to all parties. The resolution was not documented. The third folder was a handwritten letter from Denise herself. She described what she had seen during her year in Gloria's orbit. She described being invited into what initially felt like mentorship and slowly understanding that the mentorship had conditions, that information was being collected rather than shared, that her role in Gloria's world was to be shaped rather than developed. She described the night she overheard Gloria on the phone with my son-in-law, coaching him through a specific conflict with a woman he had been seeing before Claire. Coaching him, in Denise's words, the way you coach someone through a sales call, step by step, objection by objection, until the other person stops arguing. She wrote, "I didn't have proof of anything illegal. I just knew what I was watching. And I watched it long enough to know it was not an accident. I read everything twice. I called a colleague who had left the bench and moved into private practice on the kind of cases I was now looking at. Then I called Claire. She drove to my house that night and we sat on the porch in the dark, and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. She built him," Claire finally said. Not as a question. "Yes," I said. "She built him the way she built her research, on purpose." "Yes?" Claire put her hands flat on her knees and looked out at the yard for a long moment. "I want to see him," she said. "Not to negotiate. I just need to look at him one more time and say what I could never say out loud." My son-in-law had been staying at a hotel in Midtown since Claire had asked him to leave the week before. We requested a meeting at the office of her attorney, a woman I trusted completely, in a conference room with glass walls and a witness present at all times. He came in looking precisely as composed as he always looked. Controlled. Assured. He sat down across from Claire with the expression of a man who had already written the ending to the conversation and was simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. Claire let the silence sit for several seconds. She had always been good at silence. Her students knew that about her. She used it to make room for people to say the true thing instead of the easy thing. I spent a long time trying to figure out what I did wrong, she said. Every argument we had. I went back over it afterward, looking for the place where I made the mistake. That was the part you needed. You needed me looking inward. Because as long as I was examining myself, I wasn't examining you. He began to say her name. She continued. Your mother taught you how to do this. I don't say that to give you an excuse. I say it because I spent 2 years feeling like I was losing my mind, and I needed to understand the architecture of it. She identified what I was, and she coached you on how to dismantle it, piece by piece. And when dismantling wasn't fast enough, you used your hands. Something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of something that might have been recognition, or fear, or both. I am not here to beg you to change, Claire said. I don't believe you will. I'm here because I needed to hear myself say these things out loud, in a room where walking away was my choice, not yours. She stood. He said her name again. He said he had not meant for things to go the way they went. He said he loved her in a way he had never loved anyone. He said his mother was complicated, that his upbringing was complicated, that he was willing to get help, real help, whatever she needed. Claire pulled on her jacket and picked up her bag. Getting help, she said, is for your next relationship's sake, not mine. I'm already gone. She walked out of that conference room, and I watched my daughter through the glass wall, and I saw something in her posture that I had not seen in 2 years. She was walking like she knew where she was going. The documentation went to the appropriate people. There were conversations with law enforcement regarding the physical incidents. There were filings. There were formal processes that moved slowly, the way formal processes always do, but moved nonetheless. Gloria made calls. She spoke to people she believed would intervene. Several of them tried. None of them had access to what we had, and what we had was documented, specific, and corroborated by more than one source. The ethics inquiry that had been closed 9 years ago was quietly reopened by the university after a new complaint was filed with additional supporting material. My son-in-law's professional reputation, which he had spent years building with such careful intention, developed cracks that spread faster than either of them expected once the first one appeared. A restraining order was granted. He violated it once, because men who believe they hold power rarely believe consequences apply equally to them, and the violation accelerated everything. Gloria made one last attempt to reach me directly. She called from a number I didn't recognize and spoke in the measured, even tone of someone who had never in her life admitted to being cornered. She said she believed there had been misunderstandings on all sides. She said she hoped we could find a resolution that preserved everyone's dignity. I let her finish. Then I said, Gloria, I spent 31 years on the family court bench. I have heard every version of this speech. The people who give it are never concerned with dignity. They are concerned with consequences. I hope you find peace with what you've built. But it will not be built on my daughter. I ended the call. 4 years have passed since that birthday dinner in Buckhead. Since the moment I sat at that white tablecloth table and watched my son-in-law angle my daughter's face with his hand and tell her to perform happiness for the room. Claire lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur now, 10 minutes from her school. Her walls have her students' artwork on them. She has a small garden on her balcony with herbs she actually uses. She got a dog, a ridiculous and affectionate hound mix she named Footnote, who follows her from room to room as if he cannot quite believe his luck. She relaunched the mentorship program she had stepped away from. It has 43 students enrolled this year. Last spring, one of those students won a statewide essay competition, and Claire called me from the parking lot of the school, crying in the way you cry when something you believed in turns out to have been worth the fight. She laughs freely now. Not carefully, not with one ear on the room's reaction, fully, from somewhere real. She wears her hair the way she wants to. She makes decisions without asking invisible permission. She calls me on her drive home from work, the way she did before any of this began. And sometimes we talk for 45 minutes about nothing in particular. And those calls are among the most precious things in my life. She is in a relationship with someone she met through a colleague. He is a quiet man, thoughtful, who teaches high school history and has never once in any context suggested she be less than exactly what she is. She told me recently that the first time she made a strong statement in front of him and waited for the pullback, the correction, the gentle redirection, he just nodded and said, "That's a fair point. I hadn't considered that angle." She said she sat with that for 3 days trying to identify the manipulation inside it. There wasn't any. And that, she told me, was its own kind of learning. I am sharing this story because silence has never protected anyone who needed protecting. I have watched it fail in courtrooms and in kitchens and at beautifully set dinner tables in expensive restaurants. And I am done making peace with it. To every mother who has sat across from her daughter and felt that something was wrong and talked herself out of trusting that feeling, trust it. Ask the hard question. Say the true thing. You may be wrong, and your daughter will forgive you for caring. But if you are right, and you say nothing, that silence will live in both of you long after everything else has healed. To every woman who recognizes herself in what Claire survived the careful erasure, the performed happiness, the bruises covered with clothing chosen to conceal your instinct that something is wrong, is not a failure. It is the last honest part of yourself speaking. Listen to it. I want to leave you with 5 things this experience confirmed for me, from 31 years on the bench and 1 year fighting for my own child. Control does not arrive as a threat. It arrives wearing concern, and it asks you to be grateful for the attention. Isolation is always the first real weapon. When someone begins separating you from the people who knew you before them, that is not love managing its boundaries. That is fear managing its exposure. Documentation is power. If something is happening to you, write it down, date it, keep it somewhere they cannot reach. Truth needs a record to survive. The people who coach abusers are as responsible as the abusers themselves. The hand that teaches the harm carries the harm. Leaving is not the end of your story. It is the first sentence of the one you actually wanted to write. If this story found you today, it did not find you by accident. What did you take from it? And what city are you watching from? If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, share this with someone who needs to know they are not alone. Your voice is not an interruption. It is a contribution. It always has been.